Under layers of velvet and gold, beneath powdered wigs and divine titles, there was a smell, not the scent of rosewater or sacred incense, but something darker, rancid and metallic, like spoiled meat sealed in silk. For 45 years, Elizabeth I ruled England with an iron will and a powdered face, presenting herself as the untouchable virgin queen, married to her country. Her image was unshakable flawless skin, blazing red hair, eyes that bore through courtiers and spies alike. But the truth what lingered behind closed doors was something far less regal. She slept in unwashed sheets soaked with years of sweat and ointment. Her gowns, stitched with gold thread, were never laundered. Her breath, thick and sour, was so revolting that foreign diplomats recorded the stench in official correspondence. Her teeth, what remained of them, were blackened stumps from a life soaked in sugar and neglect. Every inch of her body was painted in lead, rotting her skin day by day, while she sat like marble on a throne of sickness. As the court whispered praises, they also whispered rumors about the sores beneath her makeup, the rats in her chambers, the feverish silence in the nights when her screams echoed behind tapestries. Every act of pageantry became a performance to hide the decay. Every portrait, a lie lacquered over flesh and failure. To the world, she was Gloriana, the immortal queen, but those who stood too close, those who served her night after night, knew something else. They knew the truth didn't smell like lilies. It smelled like death, wrapped in lace. She bathed 4 times a year, not because water was scarce, nor because her court lacked servants, but because the very concept of bathing was laced with dread. In the 16th century, water was feared as much as it was misunderstood, thought to weaken the body, open the pores to spirits, and invite disease through the skin. Elizabeth Tudor, Queen of England and Ireland, was considered progressive for even stepping into a tub at all. And yet, when she did, it was an ordeal. Water had to be hauled from the Thames, a river swollen with sewage, carcasses, and the industrial rot of London, heated in great copper kettles, poured into a gilded basin. The bath became a ceremonial preparation rather than an act of cleansing. The soap, if one could call it that, was little more than boiled animal fat mixed with wood ash and lye abrasive, foul-smelling, and capable of burning the skin raw. The queen's attendants rubbed it onto her body with cloths already darkened by weeks of reuse, scraping away flakes of ceruse makeup and crusted sweat. No essential oils, no lavender-scented steam, only the sharp, metallic tang of lead and old skin. The room itself, a windowless space of stone and damp tapestries, reverberated with the sounds of buckets, muffled groans, and the slap of wet linens. As steam rose, so did the odor. Her body had gone months sealed under layers of stiff brocade and velvet, accumulating salt, oils, and decay. The smell was not perfumed, it was biological, unmistakable, and persistent. When she emerged, her skin was not renewed. It was inflamed, blotched red beneath the remnants of white paint, still dry in places and oozing in others. The lead-laced ceruse used to maintain her ghost-like complexion never fully came off. It had sunk deep into her pores, bonding to the skin itself, building layer upon layer into a chalky shell that cracked when she smiled. No one dared to speak of it, yet the smell followed her down the halls like a second crown. There are letters from visiting ambassadors describing how they had to press perfumed cloths to their faces to withstand a private audience with her. One French envoy, Jacques de la Brosse, noted that she was most courteous, most regal, and yet one cannot forget the odor of her nearness, which clings to one's coat for days. Those closest to her, her ladies-in-waiting, her dressers, her physicians learned to breathe shallowly. They learned, too, not to flinch when her bare arms revealed discolored patches of skin, or when her fingers left smudges of rouge and lead on everything she touched. The ritual of dressing the queen was no less gruesome. Dozens of gowns, weighing up to 50 pounds each, were rotated not for freshness, but for appearance. None were washed. The finest silks and satins of Florence and Bruges absorbed sweat and grime until they stiffened with filth. Bodices fastened so tightly around her ribs that fainting became routine. Underneath it all, Linen chemises, meant to be the first layer of defense, were seldom changed. The fabric turned yellow, then brown. The odor of her garments, mixed with her own body, was said to be overwhelming in closed chambers, especially during summer. She was England's Gloriana, an icon of chastity and divine rule, and yet her body was a prison of ritualized rot. Every gesture of elegance, every grand procession, masked an internal siege. Her flesh bore the cost of ceremony. She wore her monarchy like armor, even as it corroded the body beneath. In portraits, she stood immortal, unmoving, unchanging. In life, she could barely breathe inside the very garments that preserved her image. Her sweat pooled beneath layers of lace. Her skin, barely touched by air, blistered under powder. Her attendants wiped away what they could, masked what they couldn't, and prayed she would not collapse. The court knew, though they never said it aloud. The scent in her chambers was not merely unpleasant, it was an omen, something unnatural, something sick. Behind the facade of control, the queen's body betrayed her, piece by piece, and everyone in that palace learned to live with it. Her mouth was a ruin long before the end. What began as luxury, a diet laced with candied fruits, sugar-coated almonds, and sweetened wine, turned over the years into slow corrosion. Sugar, once a rare indulgence, became the mark of absolute status, an edible display of sovereignty. In the halls of Whitehall and Richmond, where imported delicacies arrived weekly from the Mediterranean and West Africa, Elizabeth consumed sugar not with caution, but with ritualistic devotion. The more opulent the dessert, the more commanding the queen's presence. But the cost came in increments, first yellowing at the base of her molars, then dull aches that crept into her jaw, then gums that bled even when untouched. By her 40s, the damage was irreversible. Her teeth blackened, loosened, and in many cases fell out altogether. Her smile, once the focal point of a famously expressive face, became something she carefully concealed. When forced to speak at length in public, she would tighten her lips unnaturally or keep one side of her mouth turned from view. In private, she resorted to gritted silence. Courtiers noted that her once clear diction thickened over time, slurred by infection and empty spaces where teeth had once stood. Her meals changed to solid food, gave way to thin broths, egg yolks, and mashed stews that could be swallowed without chewing. Every bite was a reminder of decay, every swallow an exercise in pain. The breath that followed her spoke what she would not: dense, metallic, and cloying. It filled the corridors of Hampton Court like a warning. Those summoned to kneel near her feet often reported a stench unlike anything encountered in war or plague. It wasn't merely bad breath, it was necrotic, a signal that infection had taken root beyond the reach of ointment or tincture. Physicians were helpless. Remedies of the time included rinsing the mouth with vinegar, ashes, or even human urine, each more grotesque than the last. Some attempted to cauterize the nerves in her jaw with heated metal. One apothecary was said to have applied crushed pearls and opium to her gums, believing that the elegance of the substance might somehow counteract the rot. Nothing worked. The interior of her mouth became a chamber of pain. Her gums were inflamed, red and pulpy, and prone to spontaneous bleeding. The tongue carried a thick yellow coating, the result of unchecked bacterial growth, food residue, and remnants of her lead-based face paint, which sometimes fell into her lips and onto her teeth. The taste was described as metallic, with waves of bitterness that rolled across the back of her throat. Her saliva thickened, dried, and sometimes vanished altogether under stress or illness. Speaking became laborious, smiling, almost impossible. She learned to weaponize her stillness to communicate power not through words, but through the crushing silence of her gaze. Inside the palace, silence became a shield. Her ladies-in-waiting, bound by loyalty and fear, said nothing, but they could smell it on her cup, on her pillow, on the letters she sealed with wax. Diplomats wrote enciphered notes about the aroma of decay that seemed to haunt the queen's presence. One Italian envoy described it as the breath of a mausoleum warmed by fire. When foreign rulers sent envoys, their gifts included not just gold or silk, but perfume gloves and sachets meant to make meetings bearable. It was a secret passed in glances, one too dangerous to name aloud. Everyone knew, but no one dared speak. Still, she endured, even as the infection spread into her sinuses, even as fevers gripped her at night and made her hallucinate dead siblings and court conspiracies. She remained on her feet. The makeup was applied each morning to a face that no longer felt its own contours. Rouge was dabbed onto sunken cheeks. Lip stain was brushed across a mouth that cracked and bled beneath the pigment. The illusion of power required performance, and performance demanded silence. To admit illness was to admit weakness, and Elizabeth Tudor had no room for weakness. In her final years, her face became a fortress. Her jaw, swollen and uneven beneath the layers of ceruse, was held in place by will. Her food was sieved through cloth and spoon-fed. Her speech, when she gave it, was deliberate, often painful, each word born from the wreckage of infected flesh. But the image endured. Paintings captured her with full lips, flawless skin, radiant poise. The reality was buried under rouge, under sugar, under silence. The court played along. As they always had, they bowed, they sang her virtues, and when they kissed her hand, they did so quickly, before the breath of the Virgin Queen reminded them that they were kneeling before a body slowly being consumed from within. By the time Elizabeth reached her mid-30s, her hairline had begun to recede. It did not happen suddenly, but instead retreated inch by inch, revealing more of her pale scalp with each passing season. Her courtiers never spoke of it directly. They avoided looking too long. The court painter flattered her into immortality, sketching waves of auburn locks that no longer existed. But those in the royal bedchamber saw the truth. Her hair thinned not from age alone, but from poison ceruse, a deadly cosmetic made of white lead and vinegar, which she applied daily in generous layers. Each morning, it was smeared across her cheeks, her forehead, her neck. The lead seeped into her pores, poisoned her blood, and robbed her of her crown of hair. She turned to wigs, not ordinary wigs, but elaborate constructions made of real human hair, often harvested from poor women in the countryside. Blonde, red, even jet black dyed, curled, and lacquered into rigid symbols of health she no longer possessed. But these wigs were far from clean. The strands, already unwashed at the time of collection, carried lice, nits, and oil from unbathed scalps. Once fitted to the queen, the hair pieces were rarely, if ever, washed. They were powdered instead, liberally dusted with crushed starch, scented herbs, and floral compounds to mask the stench. But no powder could hide what lived underneath. Vermin thrived in the dark spaces between her scalp and the wig's base. Chafing from the heavy seams caused open sores. The lead makeup exacerbated infections, seeping into wounds and slowing any chance of healing. Her head, beneath its glorious halo of false beauty, was a battlefield of raw skin, pus, and blood. The damage spread further with time. The wigs, heavier with each design, strained her neck and temples. The powders clumped in humid weather, forming paste-like residue that hardened into foul-smelling crusts. Attendants tasked with styling the wigs often found themselves gagging from the odor. Some whispered that the smell was strong enough to cling to tapestries, to linger in the velvet chairs where she sat, to mark her presence like a phantom. A royal summons meant more than a command. It meant stepping into that cloud of decay and sweetness, where perfume and infection danced side by side. She became obsessed with control. Each wig had to be styled exactly. No locks out of place, no curls too tight or too loose. She measured appearances in inches and ounces, compensating for the slow erosion beneath. The court adjusted with her. Fashion in London mimicked her growing collection of towering hair pieces, unaware they were born from necessity, not vanity. Elizabeth's image governed not only her body, but the bodies of those around her. Her deterioration set the tone for a court addicted to illusion. Ministers wore perfumed gloves at council meetings. Ladies-in-waiting carried handkerchiefs soaked in rosewater. No one spoke of the lice, the odor, the visible tremors in her fingers as she lifted a goblet. They just bowed deeper. Even in moments of solitude, The queen could not escape the weight. Her chambers were sealed in heavy fabric and cedar to suppress the stench. Wig stands lined the walls, dozens of them, towering and grotesque in shape. Some were crawling with insects. The hair, stiff with powder, rustled like parchment in the night air. She could not sleep beneath them, and so she wore them even into evening, dozing in a chair rather than lying flat, fearing that exposure of her bald, blistered scalp might crack the illusion entirely. Doctors offered no solutions. They prescribed oils that burned. They shaved inflamed patches only to see new lesions bloom within days. One French physician suggested letting leeches feast on her scalp to drain the tainted blood. She refused. She preferred the pain she knew. By her late 40s, it became common knowledge among her household staff that the queen's hair had vanished completely. What remained was a map of scars, scabs, and veins too grotesque to paint, too sacred to expose. And still she ruled. Still she smiled from behind the painted mask, her lips cracked with rouge, her eyes rimmed with soot, her head crowned in lies. Portraits continued to immortalize her with youthful curls and radiant hair, though no such strands remained. She had become her own legend, and the legend could not afford to show its scalp. Those who stood in her presence understood what it meant to serve not a woman, but an image that demanded sacrifice of truth, of comfort, and of breath. In silence, they powdered her wigs. In silence, they carried her scent home. In silence, they watched the crown devour its host. By the final decade of her reign, Elizabeth's body had become a mausoleum of its own making. Every organ labored under the burden of years spent in ceremonial confinement. Each gesture rehearsed through layers of pain. She no longer trusted her digestion. The once celebrated royal appetite, plump roasted fowl, dense puddings, and flagons of spiced wine had decayed into unpredictable spasms of nausea, cramps, and violent purging. What she ate was often rejected. What she kept down lingered heavy and undigested. Her stomach swelled unnaturally, especially after meals, pressing against her corset so cruelly tight that breathing became an act of theater. The very costumes that defined her image now squeezed her from within, distorting her intestines and compressing her lungs. She refused to loosen them. To do so would be to admit that something had shifted beneath the surface. And in the court of Elizabeth Tudor, appearances were scripture. Even as she paced restlessly through long nights, clutching her sides and whispering to herself in fragments, her chambermaids were forbidden to speak of what they saw. At times, her belly gurgled loud enough to echo through the stone corridors. Servants stationed outside her door described a symphony of involuntary noises, groans, retching. Sudden silences broken by gasping. Her bed remained undisturbed for hours. She preferred to sit upright, propped by pillows, hands trembling slightly as she grasped a silver goblet filled with medicinal broth thickened with honey and cloves. Her physicians, increasingly desperate, prescribed syrups infused with opium and mercury, believing these to balance her humors. Instead, they worsened everything. The mercury burned her insides, bringing temporary relief followed by hours of agony. Opium dulled her pain but fractured her mind. She began forgetting names, confusing days, repeating thoughts in circles. At court, her speeches grew erratic, swinging from razor-sharp eloquence to murmured digressions. Diplomats noted the unpredictability in her tone, one moment imperial, the next disoriented. Her closest advisors learned to read her eyes rather than her words. The gas that built inside her bloated abdomen was trapped beneath layers of silk and whalebone corsetry. It tore at her bowels, bent her forward in private convulsions she never acknowledged in public. Rumors circulated among palace staff about sudden evacuations, foul-smelling linen discarded in haste, and the strange rituals surrounding her morning routine. Incense was burned not for prayer, but to combat the air in her chamber. Herbs were strewn along the baseboards to absorb moisture and odor. Her privy, kept just outside her sleeping quarters, reeked of stagnation. What emerged from her was often greenish, laced with blood and mucus, the result of a system overloaded with toxins and fed on superstition. There was no relief. Each day she dressed again, wrapped tighter than before, applying more powder, commanding her reflection into submission. Her fingers had begun to swell, her joints cracked audibly, yet she gripped her scepter with a white-knuckled fervor, refusing to display even a tremor when seated before ambassadors or nobles. The mere act of walking became a ceremony of precision. Each step masked how her hips locked from inflammation, how her thighs ached from internal swelling. She moved with measured grace because she had no other option. To falter was to fracture the illusion. Behind her eyes, something shifted. She became suspicious of silence. She believed whispers followed her between chambers. Servants reported that she stared at tapestries as if they moved. At one point, she refused to enter her own chapel, claiming the stone walls had turned warm and were breathing behind her. Her counselors dismissed it as fatigue, as nerves, as age. But the truth was more terrible. The mercury had invaded her brain. The lead had crossed into her blood. Her flesh was rotting from within, and her thoughts, once sharp as blades, now floated loose, drifting like petals on black water. She stopped sleeping altogether. For days, she would sit motionless near the window, face turned away from the court, watching nothing. Her once daily command to have her face painted grew irregular. Some days she refused altogether, tearing off the brush from her maid's hand, shrieking that it scratched her to the bone. Other days she ordered makeup applied so thickly that it cracked with every breath. Her body smelled of old ointment, sweet rot, and sour sweat. The odor was no longer something to be hidden, it had become part of her identity, an invisible cloak no perfume could replace. Her dogs, once devoted companions, began to avoid her lap. One growled when touched. Birds near her chamber window fell silent when she sat near. Courtiers stopped kneeling as close. Even her most loyal lords avoided extended audience, citing fatigue or pressing matters of state. But everyone knew what the real discomfort was. No one wanted to breathe in the death that hung around her. No one wanted to witness the monarch transformed into a monument of human deterioration. She noticed, and yet she ruled. In her agony, in her stench, in her unyielding corset and layered disguise, she ruled because to stop to collapse, to confess pain, was to let the illusion break. And Elizabeth Tudor would rather rot behind her ruff than let the world see her fall. She was the most adorned woman in the realm. Yet what clung closest to her was not her jewels or titles, but the stench of an unwashed body sealed inside gowns that had never once touched soap. Elizabeth possessed over 3,000 dresses, a collection so vast it required its own staff to maintain, though maintenance never meant cleaning. The fabrics, velvets, silks, brocades threaded with gold were deemed too delicate, too precious to endure even the crude soaps of the time, and so they were left untouched, layered over skin already infected, trapping sweat and rot until each gown became its own cocoon of decay. Beneath those heavy outer garments were underlayers just as neglected. The linen shifts closest to her skin were meant to be changed daily, but in practice were worn for weeks at a time. With each wear, they darkened, stiffened, absorbed not only the sweat of a monarch but the medicinal salves, the dried pus from burst sores, the drippings from her mouth when fever overtook her, stains set like bruises on the cloth, seamstresses mended rather than replaced, stitching over fabric that crackled from the salt of dried skin and sour oils. Each dressing became a rehearsal in discomfort, as servants maneuvered her fragile limbs into fabric hardened with residue, holding their breath against the smell that rose when the linen was lifted. Her corsets were unyielding. Whalebone and iron bars forced her torso into an upright silhouette, crushing her midsection and bruising her ribs. At times, her skin broke beneath the pressure, forming lesions that leaked slowly beneath the cloth. But loosening the corset was never an option. The appearance of youthful posture, of sovereign rigidity, outweighed the pain it inflicted. She would rather bleed inside her bodice than risk a slumped shoulder in public. The weight of her dresses was punishing. Some were so dense with embroidery and gemstones that they neared 50 pounds. When she walked, it was with slow, deliberate steps, more to manage balance than to convey grace. Long hours of standing during court functions left her legs swollen, her ankles aching, her shoes, custom fitted from fine leather, were rarely changed or cleaned. They soaked up moisture from her feet and fermented the mixture of dead skin, fungal infections, and dirt that collected inside. By evening, her stockings were damp and yellowed, clinging to calves that no longer supported her without effort. She was followed by smell, not just the sour trace of exertion, but something deeper, more permanent. It was in the folds of her gowns, in the cushions where she sat, in the air after she departed. When she moved through the palace, pages scurried ahead, not only to announce her presence, but to open windows, to burn incense, to mask what everyone had come to expect. Audiences with the queen were shortened not by policy, but by necessity. Prolonged exposure often led to nausea, to watery eyes, to servants excusing themselves mid-conversation. She insisted her garments be perfumed. Attendants dusted them with crushed rose petals, with orris root and musk. But these scents mingled with the odor already embedded in the fabric, creating an effect that was more nauseating than pleasing sweet rot layered over sour flesh. It became the scent of her reign, unforgettable and inescapable. In time, courtiers recognized her not by her voice or silhouette, but by the invisible cloud that preceded her. It was said that one could sense her approach long before her shadow reached the doorframe. The opulence of her wardrobe became an irony so bitter it could not be voiced. Elizabeth dressed like a goddess, but the body beneath was failing. Each layer of clothing served not to enhance her majesty, but to restrain the truth of her decline. Her major domo once reported that dressing her took longer each month. She grew more fragile, less responsive, more resistant to being touched. Her skin, marbled with bruises and covered in fine sores, split easily when laced too tightly. But she never once allowed a lighter gown, never once appeared in a shift, even in private chambers. She was never to be seen in anything but the full armor of royalty, no matter the state of the flesh it hid. When she undressed, it was in silence. Only the most trusted attendants were allowed to assist, and even they did so with eyes averted. The air in the room grew thick as layer after layer was removed, the scent trapped between petticoats and chemises releasing in waves. Her body bore the marks of decades of costume suffering. Her thighs were blistered, her torso wrapped in gauze beneath the corset, her feet permanently discolored and misshapen from years of standing in the damp stockings, bore cracked nails and calluses deep enough to bleed. And yet each morning, she clothed herself again in splendor, a ritual not of vanity, but of necessity. To be queen was to be seen. To be seen was to be perfect. There was no room for weakness in brocade, no space for mortality beneath the ruff. Elizabeth dressed to defy the rot, and in doing so, she transformed her garments into a prison sewn with gold thread, a cage lined with silk, held closed by expectation, tradition, and the quiet terror of being revealed. The chamber where she slept became the epicenter of her decay. Heavy tapestries draped over narrow windows, sealing out fresh air. The bed, a vast monstrosity of carved oak and gilded posts, was lined with mattresses stuffed with goose down that had soaked up years of sweat, oils, and medicinal salves. The sheets and pillowcases were seldom washed, if at all. They hardened into crusts of salt and dried ointment, yellowed like ancient parchment. When Elizabeth lay down, the linen stiffened around her, trapping every scent, every stained droplet, every fragment of flesh that clung to her skin. Nighttime brought no relief. She slept lightly, if at all. The air in the room was stale, thick with the residue of unspoken secrets and unseen microbes. Crawling from cracks in the bed frame, insects emerged, bedbugs drawn to warmth and sweat, their tiny legs scuttling over pillows and between folds of fabric. She would wake with itchy patches and bites clustered on bare arms. Servants extinguished the silver candlesticks at dusk, but the sleeping chamber remained lit by a single lamp. Its oil drip added a new pungency to the mix. Burnt candle wax mingled with the limestone sweat of a queen. Her nightwear, once fine linen, had turned stiff and coarse. The gown she changed into before bed had never been washed, but merely slipped over her head and tied at the side, its weight tolerable only because she wore it each night out of habit. Even in private, she refused freedom from its grasp. Layers of chemise, shift, gown, and robe created a barrier stronger than any armor trapping in heat, sweat, the smell of illness itself. At times, her breathing became shallow. At times, her fever flared uncontrollably. Her chambermaids monitored her slowly climbing temperature, spot testing her back with cold cloths, only to see the heat return within minutes, the stench growing deeper, more insidious. The chamber's air was so oppressive that attendants sometimes slept outside the door rather than remain inside. When Elizabeth moved, the bed groaned, its thick fibers shifting under the weight not just of the queen, but of time and decay. The smell became thicker overnight, a layer to fall into, to wake within. The cold stone floor pressed against bare feet when she finally rose, yet the luxury of carpet had been lost long ago to the same stench that rotted through furnishings. In the pre-dawn hush, she would rise, hair still powdered, face still painted, silent steps padded across the chamber to a small chamber pot. The plant-based ointments prescribed for one ailment often exacerbated another ointment for her stomach, lining turned rancid, combining with sweat and urine into a stench that curled in the air. She would sit there, weighted by exhaustion and metallic nausea, staring into the dark glass of a small mirror, seeing skin dull, cracked, sickly. She touched her face gently, as though afraid it might shatter beneath her fingertips. Then she would stand, unlace the nightgown just enough to slide into a cold shift before attendants crushed her into corset and veil. Another day awaited amid rot and illusion. Her chambers took on the characteristics of a vault filled with secret horrors. Herbs and incense burned in clay burners around the room, sage or rosemary, lavender, but the smoke barely rippled through the thick air. Cypress boughs and juniper branches were wedged beneath the bed to absorb moisture and stave off mold, but their scent turned rank in the damp darkness. A silver bowl filled with rose water stood unused, its fragrance drowned by the mildew. Even stray beams of dawn light seemed to hesitate at the doorway. Courtiers, even in the palace's heart, began to speak in hushed tones. The chamber's threshold acquired a reputation. Entering meant an assault on the senses' nasal burn that lingered on the clothes for days. Few dared to stay after midnight or before dawn. The queen was rarely visited in her night chamber. Instead, her correspondence, meals, documents, and commands were left on a small writing table near the door. She accepted silence as her only companion in that space, the walls bearing witness to her collapse. Yet when she emerged, eyes hollow, robe still heavy, a scent of old wounds clinging to her, she would step back into her public role. Portraits taken during these final years immortalize a visage untouched by the horror beneath, a queen unbroken. To the world, she appeared immortal, but her every breath, every tremor in her gait, was rooted in that night chamber, an altar of endurance where she worshipped the illusion of power even as it consumed her. When she died in the early hours of March 24th, 1603, no one dared to speak of what her body had become. Courtiers wept, not just for the end of an era, but for the smell that clung to the bedchamber, the curtains. The floorboards faint at first, then overwhelming. Embalmers refused to enter the room for days. Her skin, long scarred by poison and rot, collapsed into itself. The air turned thick, unbreathable. The rooms she once graced were abandoned, sealed, some say exorcised. Her gowns, stored away in cedar chests, were never touched again. What lingered wasn't just the memory of a queen. It was the echo of a body stretched beyond nature to serve a legend. The iron will that bound her to a throne outlasted her flesh. For decades, she had worn power like a second skin until both began to peel. Every portrait hung in Westminster is a lie lacquered in oil and myth. Beneath it all was a woman devoured by her own image, a monarch who turned her body into a relic while still alive. And long after the pageants ended, the scent of that sacrifice haunted every corridor she left behind.